Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Hello and welcome back to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram, your host, and today's topic is the basics broken down. Now, the basics broken down is simply all of the things that in an abstract level I think are important in developing a very good world. And I'm going to cover them very much like my mind map. If you do not have my mind map, it is my free giveaway. If you go to gardual.com, GARDUL.com, sign up for that newsletter. In the first wave of autoresponders, you are going to receive my mind map. And the mind map is important because it allows you to visualize what I'm talking about. Now, at the top of my mind map, which I'm not going to go over in much detail, the rules. And if you remember from my previous episode where I talk about rules, rules are the things that define your universe. And for me, it's bigger than a planet. However, I almost exclusively talk about this one world called Gardul. However, everything that gets placed in there gets run through these filters to make sure that they do not break the consistency and the fabric of my world, so it's more believable to either players or readers or people who consume my world in any fashion. The first of the basics, and I find this the most important, is places. It's basically your physical geography, not only of the world itself, but of the cosmos. You know, what can be seen from different parts of the world? How many moons does the world have? It's the cosmos, but it's from the perspective of the planet. You know, the idea that earlier on in our history, we thought we were the center of the universe because we saw things circle around us. Not realizing that we're circling around something that's circling around something that's circling around something, and we're really very small and not very central to the universe. However, we are from the perspective of our planet. So what planets in your solar system can you see? What do the different peoples in your world think of the stars, the sun, the moon, or moons? These are all important topics. And more importantly, how far is your planet from the sun? How long does it take for a year to happen for the planet to revolve one time around your sun? That helps dictate seasons, along with the tilting of your planet. That's also important. And natural wonders, you know, whether it's the Grand Canyon or it's Mount Fuji, these things that really stick out of a landscape, these things typically become important to at least the people around there and people who travel through there. They're impressed by them. It means something. Maybe they're holy. Maybe they're imperialistic. However the cultures use them, keep in mind that natural wonders, where they're not necessarily super prevalent, when they do exist, really are important, especially to the local cultures, and the travelers who pass through there will bring back stories of these things to their people. Now, these next couple really help create cultures in my mind. The things that create cultures are the races that they are, the different benefits and drawbacks that the races have will cause them to interact with the environment around them differently. So races are important. So if you're a mono-race planet like Earth where you have humans, or if you're Middle Earth where you have several different races, or Gardul where you also have several different races, the races will have an impact on the cultures that develop, even though I don't believe heavily that you have cultures or countries that are all of one race. It just doesn't happen that way. Not very often. It could. You just have to make it make sense if you want to do that in your world. Religion. The way people try and describe the world around them to make it easier for them to survive ends up forming early religions. Early religions can spring into later religions, and then you can determine whether or not religions are true or false. That is up to you and your world. But it's very important in the formation of cultures, as is language. The way people start communicating with different tribes. And different tribes that have similar religions, similar language, will typically evolve into the same cultures. And so language is a very important topic. One that I'm going to go into in depth, I'm sort of obsessed with it, which is really kind of funny when you think about the fact that I was never actually taught phonics. I was a sight learner. They thought that was smart for about a year or two when I was in school. So coming to look at the languages has actually helped me a lot think more about the sounds and the importance of sounds to people. The sound mama is very important, and at least in my culture, because that's sometimes one of the first few sounds you make. The mothers latch onto it, and they like to be called mama and dada. These are all sounds that are important. However, people typically don't use all the sounds available in their spectrum. There are certain ones that cultural groups will find important, and those are the ones that end up forming words. Those words over time become codified into the societies, and that's how languages are really formed. So language and culture sort of come together at the same place. Culture is not necessarily a nation state, but a group of similar people. They could be tribal, they could be a nation, they could be absorbed by a different nation. They can exist in many forms, but they have a certain core belief system that to them is good, and certain things to them that are bad. And along that spectrum, most people tend towards the cultural norms, but none of them will probably be exactly the cultural ideal. There could be a few or who are close enough who are considered cultural norms. However, for the most part, no one person will ever be, Joe Average. To be Joe Average in America, that means certain kinds of behaviors. You are average in all things. You are the cultural norm in America. As at least for a male or a female, if you want to be called Joe, you can be called whatever you want. That's fine with me. But to reach those cultural norms is very unlikely. However, typically you get judged by other people in your culture group by how close or how far away you are from those norms in comparison to themselves. So someone who's very close to the cultural norms might think that I'm a bad person if I'm farther away. Or I might think they're a bad person because they're a sellout. They're just a sheep that happens to do whatever society says is right. And maybe that's what I believe. And if I do believe that, then even though I'm within that same cultural context, I make my judgments based off of where I am in the spectrum of good and bad in a society compared to other people. And it works both ways. However, for it to be a culture, most people will sit near the middle of the cultural belief system. They will share enough of it that they're willing to enforce the rules upon other people, whether through a government way or through a peer way where the village elders try people for committing atrocities to the society. And those could be different. In general, you think something like murder is bad, but is it bad in all societies? Well, probably, because people typically have a compact where if you don't kill me, I don't kill you. And that's kind of a cool thing. I appreciate not being killed. So it probably is a bad thing in most cultures, if not all. However, there could be exceptions and reasons why it's okay. For example, the American culture, it is okay to kill people who committed what we consider heinous crimes. If you commit treason against the government, that is a bad enough crime in our culture that you can be killed for it. So cultures ultimately, for me, become the dominating force. And then when I apply it back to places, you get these things called countries. And countries have certain cultural makeups. So I separate the two. One culture might pretty much exclusively control a country or the vast majority of a country. It could be made up of different races. There might be some different languages or maybe some different dialects of languages spoken within there depending on how big it is, how often people communicate from region to region. Dialects could arise up. So when you speak to someone from a different region, they sound funny. Like if most people in the Northeast listen to Southerners, they think they sound funny. And most people from England probably think we sound funny. And Southerners probably think people from England and the Northeast sound funny. At least to some degree. And sometimes you have to take a little extra effort to understand each other, even though you're speaking the same language. Sometimes words mean something slightly different. And now the last thing are faces. Faces are another important aspect of my world. Faces are really, they're the people of my world. So there's one who I like to use a lot, Eric the Bard. And there's going to be some short stories released about him this year. He will be involved in my book later this year. Anyone who's ever gamed with me knows the name Eric. And they might not know him as Eric the Bard. Some do, some don't. However, he's an important character in the area of the world that I'm starting off talking about. However, all of the characters in that book, all of the people who don't get names, that villager you ride past on a horse, those are all the faces of your world. And once you codify them and decide that Eric the Bard is a person, you should have a little write-up on him. This is Eric. This is his wants, his needs. This is what he dislikes. He's of this culture, and he varies from this culture in this way. And I like to have a little spectrum diagram for all my cultures to say, here is good, here is bad, here's where this person lays on the spectrum of that cultural ideal. And so then later on, when they meet someone else from that culture, I can just look at their two spectrums and say, how likely are these two to get along? And just because they're in different parts of the spectrum doesn't mean that they won't get along. However, it could limit the amount of trust they could have for each other, or maybe it won't. But you have to take the character 1 and character 2, so Eric and we'll say William, in case that name happens to come up later, and we'll compare those two things together. And those two things will point out to us how they should connect in the world. It's the two individuals ultimately. And then if you have information written down about them, if you end up reading them later, you have a little thing to refer back to. So essentially, these are the different folders in my binder: religion, languages, race, culture, states, and faces, and places. Those are the different binders I have within mine's a virtual folder. I use Scrivener for it, which is a very good program. If you haven't used it, it's great for having a project that actually stores all of the information about your world that you know. It's always in one location. We're obviously going to go a lot more into each of these topics. You can go on infinitely about any of these topics. However, it will always be controlled and will always come away with something to do. And remember, the last thing you have to worry about, and this is to create a limit for how much you need to build. It's not the only limit, but it's an important one: technology. If I start creating a culture and a race, I'm going to have a timeline for the major things that have occurred to them to get them to that day. And then instead of a country, the same thing. What's the timeline for the country? When I have it to where it exists in my story, I don't have to build out my timeline further. I could if I want to, I don't need to. Because unless you're going to start time traveling, it's unimportant to see what the culture ends up like in 70 years from the date of your story. So it's a way to say, okay, I have enough written down about this culture, at least for now. I can stop. Let me go back and work on this later. And now for the rating for today's episode. This is, once again, a basic topic. Nothing difficult about it, something that you need to have. And yours might vary a little bit. However, I think these pretty much cover all of the important factors in a world. Obviously, there are some subtopics underneath each of those, but we'll get into those when we get there. And when I make changes, the mind map will be updated and made available to anyone who belongs to my newsletter. Now, the world building task for the day is go back to those documents you gathered up in the earlier episode and start breaking them down. Is this a document on religion? Is this a place? Is this a language? Is this a race? Is this a culture, a state, or a face that exists within? Break them all down, because those things you'll have the ability to go over and codify them in a way into that centralized location that we're talking about. The centralized location is key because if you have all these great documents and you can't find them when you're writing or creating a story, they do you no good. So go take all those documents you have gathered up, whether they're electronic, put them all in a folder on your desktop to sort through. If they're in paper, sort them out manually, but start breaking them up in these important areas. So as we go further into those topics, you'll be able to, in a central location, start writing all of these things down. And the real world task for the day is pay attention to what you're doing. Stay focused on what you're working on at the moment. For example, just yesterday or 2 days ago, I believe, I opened the car door into my head because I was thinking about world building when I was trying to get something from my car. That is a bad thing to do. Do not do that, because that hurts your head, that puts you behind schedule of what you need to do. It makes your spouse or significant other ones worry, or your family members and friends worry that you're so out in the stars that you're going to get hurt by simple activities. Now, maybe you're not as bad as I am, and I hope you're not. But that is a very important thing to do. Do focus on what you're doing at the time, to the best of your ability. And now for the T's, in the next episode, we'll be talking about the places of your world. And once again, all these topics I'm going to get more and more excited about because we're starting to get in the meat of world building, and I love world building. I look forward to talking to you then. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, where the myth rolls high.